My father-in-law paid me $200,000 to disappear. I took the money. 15 years later, at his funeral, the lawyer said my real name out loud, and my ex-wife dropped her phone like she'd just seen a ghost. Folks, Uncle Mickle here. And I'm not proud of every decision I've made in this life. But I'll tell you the truth, straight and clean. Because sometimes the choices that look like weakness on the outside are the only way a man survives what's happening underneath. This all started in a quiet little town in Ohio, back when I still believed love was enough to build a life on. I was 32, steady job, small house, with a porch that creaked in the winter. I thought I'd found something solid, something permanent. Her name was Emily. She had that calm way about her. Soft voice, sharp mind, the kind of woman who could walk into a loud room and somehow make it feel still. I met her at a hardware store, of all places. I was buying paint. She was arguing with a clerk about the difference between eggshell and satin like it was a life-or-death situation. I married her 8 months later. Now, before you judge that timeline, let me ask you something. Have you ever met someone who just felt right? Like your life had been waiting for them? That's what it felt like to me. Clean. Certain. Her parents, though, that was another story. Her father, Richard, was the kind of man who didn't smile with his eyes. Successful developer. Owned half the commercial buildings downtown. Wore expensive watches, but acted like he'd earned every second the hard way. He shook my hand at our engagement dinner and held it just a little too long. Take care of my daughter, he said. It wasn't a request. Still, I thought I could win him over. I worked hard, showed up to family dinners, fixed things around their lake house without being asked. I believe time softened men like him. It doesn't. 2 years into our marriage, he invited me to his office alone. Said he wanted to talk man to man. That phrase should have warned me. His office was cold. Not temperature, energy. Everything gray and glass and sharp edges. He didn't offer coffee. Didn't ask about my drive. He slid a manila envelope across the desk. Inside was a cashier's check. $200,000. He folded his hands like he was discussing weather. I want you to leave Emily, he said. Quietly. No drama. No scene. Just like that. Now pause with me for a second. If someone handed you more money than you'd ever seen at once and told you to walk away from the person you loved, what would you feel first? Anger? Temptation? Confusion? Because I felt all three. I laughed at first. Thought it was some twisted loyalty test. But he didn't laugh back. She'll be better off, he continued. You're not the future I planned for her. Planned. Like she was a business merger. I told him no. Flat and simple. Pushed the envelope back. He didn't argue. He just leaned back in his chair and studied me. The way a man studies a chessboard when he already sees 10 moves ahead. And that's when he said something that made my stomach turn. You don't understand the position you're in. I left that office shaken, but still stubborn. Still in love. I thought the worst was over. It wasn't. Because 3 weeks later, Emily asked me for a divorce. No explanation. No tears. Just quiet resignation. And the envelope showed up again. This time, I didn't push it back. And that's where the real story begins. Before everything cracked open, my life felt steady. Not flashy. Not dramatic. Just steady. And at 32 years old, steady felt like a blessing. I had a modest home with white siding that needed repainting every few years, a truck that started on the second try in winter, and a wife who used to leave little sticky notes in my lunchbox that said things like, "Don't work too hard, handsome." That kind of simple love sneaks up on you. It doesn't announce itself. It builds quietly in routines. Saturday mornings with coffee on the porch, folding laundry together while some old sitcom plays in the background, arguing playfully about which pizza place is better. Those little things, they become the foundation. And when you stand on them long enough, you stop looking down to check if they're still solid. Emily worked part-time at a local interior design firm. She had an eye for detail. She'd walk into a room and immediately start moving things around in her mind. I admired that about her. She saw potential where others saw clutter. At home, she was warm, attentive. We weren't loud with our love, but it was there. In the way she'd reach for my hand during movies. In the way she'd lean her head against my shoulder without thinking about it. I believed she chose me. and I believed that mattered more than what her father thought. Now her mother, Linda, was softer. Polite smiles, gentle questions about my job. But even she carried that subtle distance, like she was observing me instead of accepting me. Family dinners at their lake house always felt like job interviews, disguised as hospitality. Richard would ask about my 5-year plan. I worked in construction management. Good job. Honest job. But it wasn't corporate. It wasn't glamorous. And every time I answered him, I could feel him measuring my ambition against whatever silent standard he'd built for his daughter. Still, Emily defended me. At least in the beginning. One night after a tense dinner, she squeezed my hand in the car and said, "Don't let him get to you. He just thinks in numbers." I laughed it off, told her I wasn't worried, but somewhere in the back of my mind, a small question formed. Why did she feel the need to reassure me at all? We lived 2 lives, in a way. Our small-town reality, simple, grounded. And then the version of life her parents imagined. Country clubs, business partners, generational wealth. I told myself love could bridge that gap. And for a while it did. Until little changes started appearing. Emily began staying later at work. She stopped bringing up future plans, kids, vacations, renovating the kitchen. When I mentioned them, she'd nod, but her eyes wouldn't quite meet mine. Subtle things. Easy to ignore. And I ignored them. Now let me ask you something before I go further. Have you ever had that quiet shift in your relationship? Nothing dramatic. Just a slight change in tone. A different kind of silence at the dinner table. And you tell yourself it's stress. Or work. Or just life. Tell me in the comments. Have you ever felt something slipping but convinced yourself it was fine? Because that's exactly what I did. I convinced myself that marriages go through phases. That ambition and family pressure were normal. That love doesn't always feel electric. Sometimes it just feels comfortable. But comfort can hide cracks. The night before Richard called me into his office, Emily barely touched her dinner. She kept glancing at her phone. When I asked if everything was okay, she smiled, but it was rehearsed. "Just tired," she said. That smile didn't reach her eyes. And here's the part that still gets me. Even after all these years, I wanted to believe her so badly that I ignored the knot in my stomach. Sometimes we don't miss the warning signs. We silence them. I went to bed that night thinking we were just in a rough patch. The next afternoon, I was sitting across from her father while he slid that envelope toward me. Looking back now, I realized something important. The storm had already started. I just hadn't stepped outside to feel the rain yet. When a man like Richard calls you into his office alone, you don't walk in relaxed. You walk in alert. I remember the elevator ride up to the 12th floor of his downtown building. Glass walls, polished steel, everything spotless. It felt less like an office and more like a monument to control. His assistant didn't smile when I gave my name. She just nodded and pressed a button on her headset. "He's expecting you." Of course he was. I stepped into his office, and the first thing I noticed was the silence. Thick, heavy, no family photos, no warmth. Just floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city like he owned every inch of it. He didn't ask about Emily. Didn't ask about work. He went straight to business. "I'll be direct," he said. And then he slid that envelope across the desk. $200,000. Even now, saying it out loud sounds unreal. At that point in my life, that was more money than I'd ever had in my bank account at one time. It was mortgage paid-off money. Start over anywhere money. "I want you to leave her," he said calmly. "File quietly. No public mess." I thought I misheard him, but he held eye contact. "You're not aligned with where she's going," he continued. "This will be easier for everyone." Everyone. He didn't raise his voice. Didn't insult me directly. That would have been easier to fight. Instead, he framed it like a business transaction. Clean, efficient, emotionless. I pushed the envelope back. "I love your daughter," I said. My voice was steady, but my chest was tight. "That's not for sale." He studied me. Not angry. Not surprised. Just calculating. "You don't understand the position you're in," he replied. That sentence stuck with me. Because it wasn't a threat. It was a statement. I left that office unsettled. Not because of the money, but because of how certain he seemed that I would eventually say yes. When I got home that evening, Emily was sitting at the kitchen table. No TV on. No music. just her hands folded in front of her. She looked prepared. There's a specific kind of silence before bad news. If you've ever experienced it, you know what I'm talking about. It's not loud. It's not dramatic. It just feels final. She didn't ask how my day was. She didn't mention her father. She just said, "We need to talk." Now, folks, let me pause right here and ask you something. If you were in my shoes at that moment, fresh out of a meeting where your father-in-law offered you money to disappear, would you have confronted her immediately? Would you have told her everything right then? Or would you have waited to see what she said first? Drop your answer below. I'm curious what you would have done. Because I chose to stay quiet. She took a breath. Long controlled. I've been thinking a lot about our future, she began. That word, future, felt like a trap. She talked about growth, about opportunity, about how sometimes two good people just want different things. She never mentioned her father. Not once. And I watched her. Not her words, her body. Her hands were steady. Her voice didn't shake. This wasn't spontaneous. This was rehearsed. I asked her one simple question. Is this what you want? She hesitated. Not long. Just enough. I think it's what's best. Best. That word again. I nodded slowly. Didn't argue. Didn't yell. But inside, something shifted. Because I realized this conversation didn't start in our kitchen. It started in that glass office. And for the first time, I wasn't sure if my marriage was falling apart, or if it had already been decided for me. What would you have done next? Would you have fought harder? Or would you have started paying attention like I did? Because what I discovered next changed everything. That night, after Emily said she thought divorce was what's best, I didn't argue. And that scared her. I could see it in her eyes. She expected resistance, tears, maybe anger. But I just nodded and said, "Okay." Sometimes silence reveals more than shouting ever could. We slept in the same bed that night, but it felt like there was an ocean between us. I stayed awake long after she drifted off, listening to her breathing, trying to hear if there was regret in it. There wasn't. The next morning, she left early for work. No goodbye kiss. Just a quiet see you. That's when I did something I'd never done before in our marriage. I checked a phone bill. Not because I wanted to be that guy. Not because I was suspicious by nature, but because something wasn't lining up. Her distance, her father's certainty, the rehearsed tone in her voice. And there it was. Repeated calls. Same number. Almost daily. Sometimes late at night. The number belonged to her father's office. Now think about that. If she was independently deciding to leave me, why was she talking to him so much right before asking for a divorce? I felt the first real crack in my chest right then. But I wasn't done. I drove downtown during my lunch break and sat across the street from her design firm. I didn't know what I expected to see. Some dramatic betrayal? Another man? No. What I saw was worse. Around 3:15 p.m., a black sedan pulled up. I recognized it instantly. Richard's driver stepped out and opened the back door. Emily came out of the building 5 minutes later. She didn't look surprised. She didn't hesitate. She got in. That's when it hit me. This wasn't a disagreement between husband and wife. This was coordination. I need you to understand something here. This wasn't just betrayal. This was my entire life being negotiated behind closed doors. Have you ever had that moment where the person you trusted most suddenly felt like a stranger? Where you realized conversations were happening without you about you? If you've been blindsided like that, tell me in the comments. Not to relive it, but because sometimes saying it out loud helps you reclaim it. I followed the car. Not close enough to be obvious. Just enough to see where they went. They drove to his office building. And for the next 2 hours, my wife was upstairs with the man who had just offered me money to disappear. When she came back down, she was holding a folder. That folder looked exactly like the one he slid across his desk to me. My stomach dropped. I didn't confront her that night. Instead, I waited. 3 days later, she handed me divorce papers. Already drafted. Already notarized. "Let's do this clean," she said softly. Clean. That word again. I asked her one question. Did he put you up to this? Her eyes flickered, just slightly, before she answered. No, this is my decision. But I knew. And then came the final blow. 2 nights before I was supposed to move out, I overheard her on the phone. She thought I was asleep. Yes, she whispered. He'll take it. He doesn't have a choice. He'll take it. Not we decided. Not I decided. He'll take it. And in that moment, the last illusion shattered. It wasn't about love fading. It wasn't about different futures. It was about leverage. And I realized something brutal and clear. I wasn't being divorced. I was being bought out. That was the lowest point of my life. Because the woman I married didn't just choose her father's vision over me. She participated in it. And standing there in the dark hallway, listening to her whisper about my lack of options, I made a decision that would change all of our lives. You think taking the money was weakness? Wait until you hear what I did next. That night in the hallway, listening to my wife talk about me like I was a contract, waiting to be signed, something inside me went quiet. Not broken. Quiet. You ever had that happen? Where the anger doesn't explode, it settles. Hardens. That's what it felt like. I walked back to bed, lay down beside her, and for the first time since I'd met Emily, I didn't feel love when I looked at her. I felt clarity. The next morning, I made coffee like usual, asked her how she slept, kissed her cheek before work. She looked almost relieved, because she thought I'd folded. But what I was really doing was thinking. Now here's the part people struggle with. Why didn't I fight? Why didn't I confront Richard publicly? Why didn't I expose their scheme right then? Because power doesn't always come from noise. Sometimes it comes from patience. I went back to Richard's office 2 days later. No appointment. Just walked in. His assistant looked startled, but I didn't wait. He didn't seem surprised to see me. You reconsidered, he said. Not a question. I sat down across from him, looked him in the eye. I have conditions, I replied. That caught his attention. Now let me explain my mindset at that moment. I wasn't chasing revenge. Not yet. I was reclaiming dignity. If they wanted a transaction, fine. But I would write the terms. 40% of this decision was practical. I wasn't blind. My marriage was over. Emily had already chosen. Fighting her would only drag out pain. The money meant a fresh start. No debt, no strings. 30% was emotional reflection. I had to accept something hard. I loved a version of Emily that no longer existed, or maybe never did. That realization stings deeper than betrayal itself. And the remaining 30%? That was where the steel formed. Because if they thought I was small enough to be erased quietly, they underestimated me. I wanted structured as a settlement. I told him. Legal. Documented. No clause preventing me from speaking if asked. His eyebrow lifted slightly. You plan to speak? He asked. Not unless necessary, I said calmly. What I meant was this. I wasn't going to scream, but I wasn't going to vanish either. We drafted everything through attorneys. Official. Clean. The divorce papers were signed within 30 days. Emily didn't fight for the house. Didn't argue over assets. She moved back into her parents' lake property temporarily, I heard. And just like that, I was alone. I packed what mattered. Sold the house. Left town without telling anyone where I was going. But here's the detail nobody knew, not even Richard. I didn't cash the check immediately. I opened a separate account under my full legal name. And that's important, because the name they knew me by wasn't the name on my birth certificate. See, most people called me Mickle. It was a shortened version of my middle name. Even Emily rarely used my full name. I'd always preferred it that way. Cleaner. Simpler. But legally, I was Michael James Thornton, and I made sure every document tied to that money carried that name clearly. I wasn't plotting chaos. I was preserving identity. There's a difference. Over the next year, I rebuilt quietly. New state. New job. Used part of the money to start a small contracting firm. Nothing flashy. Just steady growth. I kept my head down and worked. Time passed. 5 years. 10. 15. I heard through old contacts that Emily eventually married someone her father approved of. A corporate attorney named Daniel. Big wedding. Country club. The life Richard envisioned. Good for them. Or so I told myself. But here's where I want to ask you something. When someone betrays you that deeply, Is the right move to walk away and never look back? Or is there value in making sure the truth eventually surfaces? Do you believe in revenge or in peace? Tell me honestly in the comments. I've seen both sides. Because I chose something in between. I didn't chase them. I didn't sabotage them. I simply waited. Not for their downfall. For inevitability. And inevitability came 15 years later, when both of her parents passed within months of each other, and I received a certified letter summoning me to the reading of the will. That's when I knew the final move wasn't mine. It was Richard's. The letter was simple, formal, cold. My full legal name typed clean across the top. Michael James Thornton. Not Mickle. Not the name Emily used. The real one. I hadn't heard from that family in 15 years. No calls. No emails. No holiday cards pretending to be polite. So when that envelope arrived at my office, I just stared at it for a while. Then I booked a flight back to Ohio. The funeral home smelled the same as it had when I attended my own father's service years before. Heavy air. Muted carpets. Too many whispers. Emily was there. 15 years older. Still poised. Still controlled. She didn't see me at first. I stood near the back. Quiet. Watching. Now let me tell you something. Walking into a room where people think you don't exist anymore, it does something to your spine. You stand straighter. Not out of pride. Out of proof. When her eyes finally found me, they widened just slightly. Confusion first. Then recognition. Then something else. Fear. She didn't approach me. Neither did Daniel, her husband. The service was uneventful. Polite tears. Polished eulogies about legacy and discipline and vision. Vision. I almost smiled. 2 days later, we gathered in Richard's attorney's office for the will reading. Same building. Same glass walls. Different energy. This time, I wasn't the uncertain son-in-law sitting across the desk. I was a man who had lived 15 full years without them. The attorney cleared his throat and began. Standard distributions first. Charitable foundations. Business assets. Real estate divided between Emily and several investment trusts. Then he paused. And finally, he said, adjusting his glasses, a personal addendum. The room shifted. He unfolded a separate document. In accordance with Mr. Richard Lawson's final instructions, Emily stiffened at her maiden name being used formally. A sum of $500,000 has been placed in a long-term trust under the name Michael James Thornton. Silence. Heavy. Confused. Daniel leaned forward. Who? He asked sharply. The attorney continued. Mr. Lawson specified that this amount represents what he described as a correction of interference. He further stated that this trust is to be released publicly, with the explanation attached. Emily's phone slipped from her hand and hit the hardwood floor. Because she knew. The attorney looked directly at me. Are you Michael James Thornton? I stood up slowly. Yes, I said. Clear. Steady. And this trust, he continued, is acknowledgement that Mr. Lawson coerced the dissolution of your marriage 15 years ago. He states in writing that his actions were driven by control and pride, and that he misjudged your character. Gasps. Daniel turned to Emily. She looked like the ground had vanished beneath her. The attorney read the final line. Some men are not measured by their bank accounts, but by what they refuse to sell. And just like that, the narrative shattered. Now let me pause right here. Are you rooting for me in this moment? Or do you think this was unnecessary? Too much? Too public? Be honest in the comments. Uncle Mickle can take it. Because I didn't smile. I didn't gloat. I didn't even look at Emily for long. I just nodded once and sat back down. The damage wasn't loud. It was precise. Richard, even in death, admitted the truth. Admitted the manipulation. Admitted that I wasn't the disposable piece he thought I was. And Emily? She wasn't exposed for cheating. She wasn't humiliated publicly in some dramatic scene. She was confronted with something far worse. Proof that her father respected the man she helped discard. That kind of realization doesn't scream. It cracks silently. After the meeting, Daniel stormed out first. Emily stayed seated, staring at the floor. For the first time in 15 years, she looked unsure. And for the first time in my life, I felt no anger toward her. Just distance. The storm that started in that office long ago had finally cleared. But closure? Closure isn't a moment. It's what you choose to do next. After the will reading, the room emptied slowly. Chairs scraped. Papers shuffled. Polite murmurs filled the space, like people were trying to smooth over something that couldn't be smoothed. I stayed seated for a minute. Not because I didn't know what to do, but because I wanted to feel the quiet after the storm. Emily was still there. Daniel had already walked out, jaw tight, phone pressed to his ear. Damage control, probably. Image management. That world never changes. She didn't look at me at first. Then she did. And for a long second, we just stared at each other. No shouting. No dramatic confrontation. Just 15 years, sitting between us like an invisible table. You knew? She asked finally. Her voice wasn't angry. It was fragile. I suspected, I said. That was the truth. She nodded slowly, absorbing that. Her eyes were red, but not from her father's funeral. From something else. Something heavier. He never told me he added that, she whispered. I believed her, because control was Richard's language. Even in confession, he held the pen. We didn't rehash the past. There was no point. Some stories don't need replaying. They just need acknowledgement. I'm sorry, she said. And here's something you might not expect. It didn't feel like victory hearing that. It felt late. Not meaningless. Just late. Have you ever received an apology years after the damage was done? Did it heal anything for you? Or did it just confirm what you already knew? Tell me in the comments. I'm curious how that landed for you. For me, it was strange. The anger I carried for so long had already faded over time. Not because she deserved forgiveness, but because carrying it was exhausting. Time had already done most of the work. I left the building without saying much more. The air outside felt different from 15 years ago. Or maybe I did. I stayed in town for 2 more days to handle paperwork for the trust. The attorney was professional, quietly respectful. The documents were clear. Richard had not only admitted to orchestrating the divorce, but he'd structured the trust to ensure public record. He didn't just regret it privately. He corrected it publicly. That matters. I didn't need the money. My business had grown steadily over the years. Nothing flashy, but solid. The kind of stability that comes from sweat instead of inheritance. So I made a decision. I donated half of that trust to a local scholarship fund under my legal name. Michael James Thornton. Trade school scholarships. Kids who wanted to build something with their hands. The other half, I invested into expanding my company. Not out of spite, out of growth. Looking back now, I wonder if I'd do it the same way again. Would I have fought harder for my marriage back then? Would I have confronted Richard immediately? Would I have demanded Emily choose openly instead of letting it unravel quietly? What about you? If you could go back to your worst betrayal, would you handle it differently? Or was the pain necessary to become who you are now? For me, that pain carved out something important. Self-respect. See, I used to think dignity came from defending yourself loudly, proving your worth in front of everyone. Now I know sometimes it comes from walking away when someone underestimates you. Emily reached out once more before I left town. A short message. I didn't understand what I was losing. I didn't respond, not out of cruelty, but because understanding comes from living with choices. And she had. As for me, I boarded that plane back home feeling lighter than I had in years. Not because I won, not because she lost, but because the truth had finally surfaced without me having to drag it into the light. And that's a powerful thing. The boy who walked into Richard's office 15 years ago felt small. The man who walked out of that same building felt steady. And that steadiness, that's what carried me forward. There's something people don't tell you about betrayal. It doesn't just break your heart. It rearranges your identity. For a long time after my divorce, I questioned myself more than I questioned them. Was I naive? Was I not ambitious enough? Did loving someone quietly make me weak in a world that rewards loud power? Those thoughts creep in at night, especially when the house is empty. But here's what 15 years taught me. A man's value isn't determined by who chooses him. It's determined by what he refuses to become when he's rejected. I could have turned bitter, could have chased revenge actively, could have exposed everything immediately, tried to burn their world down the way mine felt burned. But bitterness is a debt that charges interest daily, and I didn't want to live bankrupt. Richard thought money solved problems. In a way, he stayed consistent to the end. He tried to fix control with compensation. But the irony is this: the moment he publicly admitted what he did, he gave me something more valuable than the original $200,000 ever was. He gave me back my name, Michael James Thornton. Not the nickname, not the simplified version, the full identity. And sometimes reclaiming your full identity is the real victory. Now let me ask you something, and I really want your honest thoughts. Is it better to forgive and quietly move on, or to make sure they understand exactly what they lost? There's no perfect answer. Some of you will say peace matters most. Others will say accountability matters more. Drop your thoughts in the comments. Let's talk about it like grown folks who've lived a little. Here's what I believe now. Revenge feels powerful in the moment. Closure feels powerful for a lifetime. But closure doesn't always come from confrontation. Sometimes it comes from living well enough that the truth catches up on its own. I didn't orchestrate that final reveal at the will reading. I didn't plan it. I simply stayed steady long enough for the scales to balance. And when they did, I didn't feel triumph. I felt release. There's a difference. Emily and I never reconnected. We didn't become friends. We didn't circle back to what could have been. Some chapters don't need epilogues, but I do hope she learned something about choice. And I know I did. If someone tries to buy your absence, it says more about their fear than your worth. So here's my final question for you, and I mean it. When life tests your dignity, do you fight to prove yourself, or do you trust that your character will outlast their control? Sit with that, because the loudest victories aren't always the strongest ones. Sometimes the strongest victory is becoming unshakable. So that's my story, folks. If it resonated with you, go ahead and hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and tell me in the comments where you're listening from. I want to know how far Uncle Mickle's voice travels. And remember this: when someone underestimates your worth, don't shrink to fit their vision. Stand still long enough for the truth to do the talking.